London fog pressed thick against the windows of 221B Baker Street. Holmes sat beside the dying fire, bored, until a telegram arrived. Sir Reginald Ashcombe had been found dead in his locked library, a revolver beside his hand, and a suicide note bearing his signature. Scotland Yard saw suicide. Everyone trusted his niece, Eleanor Vale. Everyone, except Miss Marple. But Holmes noticed something smaller, a smear of reddish mud and copper dust upon the dead man's boot, a tiny ember, and from that ember, the flames of deduction would begin to spread. The truth was hiding in the shadows, and soon it would burn them all away. The fire had begun. Chapter 1. The First Spark. The events I am about to relate occurred in November of 1893, when a bitter fog had settled over London and made every gas lamp appear like a dying ember in the darkness. I find myself once again setting pen to paper to record the strange circumstances that brought Sherlock Holmes and myself to Witchwood House in Kensington, where a respected gentleman had been found dead beneath circumstances that Scotland Yard considered perfectly straightforward. Yet, as I learned that night, the simplest explanation is not always the true one, and sometimes the smallest ember contains enough heat to set an entire mystery ablaze. It had been an unusually quiet evening at 221B Baker Street. Holmes lounged in his mouse-colored dressing gown beside the coal fire, his Persian slipper resting upon the mantel, and his Stradivarius lying untouched across the chair. The familiar scents of tobacco, warm coal, and Mrs. Hudson's supper drifted through the sitting room, while rain whispered against the windows, and I had just begun reading the evening newspaper when Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded upon the 17 stairs. She entered with a telegram upon a small silver tray, and Holmes's eyes immediately sharpened. "From Scotland Yard?" I asked. "No, Watson. Kensington." He broke the seal and read silently. Then he passed the telegram to me. "Sir Reginald Ashcombe, found dead at Witchwood House. Apparent suicide. Revolver beside body. Note signed by victim. Inspector Lestrade requests your assistance." I confess that I saw little mystery in it. "You appear disappointed," I remarked. Holmes drew slowly upon his pipe, the smoke curling through the gaslight. "Not disappointed, Watson. Merely curious. Suicide cases rarely require my attention. Murder, however, is another matter." Before I could answer, he rose with sudden energy and reached for his coat. The hansom cab carried us through the wet streets of Marylebone and toward Kensington. London was almost invisible beneath the fog. Wheels clattered over cold cobblestones, horses snorted clouds of steam into the icy air, and somewhere beyond the houses a distant foghorn sounded from the Thames. I remember the smell of wet wool and horse manure as our cab passed through the crowded streets, while gas lamps flickered like small yellow flames behind curtains of mist. At Witchwood House we were met by Inspector Lestrade. The house belonged to another world. Its polished mahogany doors, expensive carpets, silver ornaments, and servants in black coats announced considerable wealth, while the nervous footman who admitted us seemed determined not to meet my eyes. Inside, the air was stuffy despite the cold outside, and the faint smell of carbolic soap suggested that someone had already attempted to clean the scene. Sir Reginald Ashcombe lay in his library. He was a broad-shouldered man of 62, dressed in evening clothes, with one hand resting beside a revolver. A sheet of expensive cream paper lay upon the desk, bearing what appeared to be his signature, and several lines declaring that he had become tired of life. "The case is plain," Lestrade said. "Financial troubles, family disputes, a suicide note, weapon beside the body. Holmes ignored him. He crouched beside the corpse. I watched him examine the dead man's cuffs, collar, fingers, shoes, and finally the carpet beneath his chair. His face had acquired that peculiar stillness I knew so well. "What do you see?" I asked. "The spark." He pointed toward Sir Reginald's right boot. Upon the leather was a smear of reddish-brown mud. I confess I saw nothing remarkable. Holmes produced his lens. "Observe the color, Watson. Red clay mixed with coal dust." He scraped a minute quantity from the boot onto a card. "Interesting. Could it not have come from the garden?" "No." His answer was immediate. "Why? The soil surrounding this house is pale London clay. This is darker, denser, and contaminated by industrial residue." He examined it again. "Furthermore, there are traces of copper." "Copper?" I looked down at the boot once more. Nothing. Holmes smiled faintly. "A small ember, Watson, but it glows with meaning. You, dear reader, may have noticed what I did not. At the time, however, I could not imagine how a little mud could possibly challenge the evidence of a revolver and a signed note." Holmes turned to the desk. "The second ember." He lifted the suicide note. "Sir Reginald's handwriting? Apparently." "Apparently," Holmes repeated. He examined the page beneath the gaslight. "The signature is genuine." Lestrade looked triumphant. "But the writing above it is not." The inspector stared. "How can you tell?" Holmes pointed toward the paper. "The pressure differs." The signature was written naturally. The preceding sentences were copied by someone concentrating intensely upon imitation. Lestrade frowned. "You're saying someone forged the note." "I am saying that the note was written by someone attempting to make us believe it was written by Sir Reginald." The room seemed suddenly colder. Then a woman's voice came from the doorway. "That is what I thought." We turned. A small, elderly woman stood there, neatly dressed and carrying a modest handbag. Her expression was calm, almost gentle. "Miss Marple," Lestrade said with visible irritation. "Mr. Holmes," she said. Holmes regarded her with interest. "You have an opinion? I believe Sir Reginald was murdered." "Why?" She looked toward the body. "Because everyone here believes his niece could never have harmed him." I glanced toward Holmes. "The niece, Eleanor Vale," Lestrade explained. "Sir Reginald's ward. She discovered the body." "Everyone trusts her," Miss Marple continued softly. "Everyone except me." Holmes's eyes gleamed. The careful listener may already be asking the obvious question. Why would a respected elderly lady from the countryside suspect the woman everyone else considered innocent? Holmes did not ask. Instead, he examined the floor. There, beneath the edge of the desk, he found something else. A tiny black button. He picked it up between two fingers. "This," he said, "is our third ember." Lestrade groaned. "I suppose you'll tell me that proves murder." "No. It proves only that someone wearing a dark coat stood here." Holmes placed the button into an evidence envelope. "But the question is why?" At that moment, Eleanor Vale entered the library. She was young, pale, and elegantly dressed, with tear-stained eyes. She looked at her uncle's body and covered her mouth, while the servants gathered silently in the corridor. I felt immediate sympathy for her. Holmes merely watched. Eleanor turned toward him. "Mr. Holmes, surely you do not believe I could have done this?" Holmes's voice was quiet. "I believe nothing until I have sufficient data." Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, and the gas flames trembled in their glass fittings. Looking back, I should have noticed Eleanor's first question. She did not ask who killed my uncle. She asked whether Holmes believed she had done it. At the time, the significance was lost upon me. Holmes, however, noticed. He always noticed. The first embers glowed in the darkness. The fire of truth had begun. Chapter 2. Gathering Kindling. I set down these events as they occurred, though I confess that the morning after Sir Reginald Ashcombe's death seemed to me more confusing than the night before. What had begun as an apparent suicide had already become a murder inquiry, and every person connected with Witchwood House seemed to possess some secret capable of casting suspicion upon them. Outside, November fog clung to Kensington like damp wool, while gas lamps burned weakly along the streets and hansom cabs rattled over the wet cobbles. Holmes and I returned to the house shortly after 8 o'clock. The cold had sharpened during the night, and my fingers were stiff beneath my gloves as we climbed the stone steps. A footman admitted us, and the smell of coal smoke, carbolic soap, and yesterday's breakfast greeted us from the corridor. "Watson," Holmes said, removing his gloves, "we have 3 embers already, the mud, the handwriting, and the button. And 5 suspects. 6, if one includes the mysterious visitor." I looked at him sharply. "You have not mentioned a 6th suspect. I have not yet decided whether he exists." The remark left me thoroughly dissatisfied. Miss Marple was waiting in the drawing-room. She sat beside the cold grate, with her hands folded calmly upon her handbag, looking more like a respectable aunt visiting relatives than an amateur investigator examining a murder. "You have been busy," Holmes observed. "I have been listening, often more useful." She smiled. Our first suspect was Eleanor Vale. She entered wearing a dark morning dress, her face pale from lack of sleep. She told us that she had discovered her uncle shortly after 10 o'clock the previous evening. "I heard nothing unusual," she said. "I was in the drawing-room, reading, yes. What book?" She hesitated. "A novel." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Which novel?" "I do not remember. I confess, I saw nothing remarkable in the answer." Holmes did. You, dear reader, may already be asking yourself why a simple question about a book should matter. Holmes did not accuse her. Instead, he asked about her uncle. Was Sir Reginald depressed? No. Financially troubled? No. Did he fear anyone? Eleanor lowered her eyes. He had enemies, names, businessmen, political opponents, men who disliked his charitable work. Holmes nodded. Then came the first contradiction. Eleanor claimed Sir Reginald had been working alone in the library all evening. Yet Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, told us that Eleanor had entered the library shortly after 9. "I saw her," Mrs. Bell insisted. "She carried a cup of tea." Eleanor denied it. One small contradiction. A small ember. Did you catch its glow? Our second interview was with Charles Ashcombe, Sir Reginald's nephew. Charles was a handsome man in his 30s, but his polished clothing could not conceal the nervous movements of his hands. He smelled faintly of cheap tobacco and wet leather, and there was a dark stain upon one cuff. "I was not in the house after 8, he said. "Where were you?" "At my club." "Which club?" "The Imperial." Holmes examined him silently. "Did you see Sir Reginald yesterday?" "No." "Did you quarrel?" "No." Holmes suddenly reached for Charles's wrist. The young man recoiled. "Why do you have blood upon your cuff?" Charles stared at it. Then he laughed nervously. "Wine." Holmes smelled the cloth. "Indeed." I confess I had been ready to accept Charles's explanation. Holmes was not. A few minutes later, however, we discovered that the stain was indeed claret. Charles had been involved in a quarrel at his club. He had lied about the quarrel, but not about the murder. Another ember that failed to ignite. Our third suspect was Dr. Lionel Mercer. The physician was a nervous, thin-faced man with silver spectacles and a clipped beard. His consulting room smelled of chemicals, ink, and medicinal spirits, and several bottles stood upon polished shelves beneath the gaslight. "You examined Sir Reginald yesterday?" Holmes asked. "At 7. His condition?" "Stable." "Could he have died naturally?" "Yes." Holmes looked toward me. I understood. The revolver might have been staged after death. "Did you prescribe anything?" "Digitalis." "Why?" "He had a weak heart." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "How much?" Mercer looked at her. "A normal quantity." "Was it?" The doctor hesitated. Holmes immediately noticed. The careful listener, he said quietly, will have noticed that hesitation. Dr. Mercer finally admitted that he had altered the dosage 2 weeks earlier. On Sir Reginald's instructions, Holmes's expression remained unreadable. We then questioned Julian Pike, Sir Reginald's secretary. Pike was a precise young man with narrow spectacles and immaculate cuffs. He spoke carefully, almost mechanically, and kept glancing toward the library. I was working upstairs until 11. Alone? Yes. What were you working on? Letters. Any particular letters? Business correspondence. Holmes walked to the desk. Where is your tobacco? Pike looked confused. My tobacco? You smoke Turkish cigarettes. The man's face changed. Occasionally, Holmes pointed toward the fireplace. A cigarette end lay among the ashes. Turkish tobacco. Pike's. The ember smoldered. Yet you claim you were upstairs, Holmes said. I came downstairs briefly. When? 9. Mrs. Bell says you came downstairs at 10. Pike swallowed. Another contradiction. Fan this ember with me, Watson. What does it reveal? Not guilt. Not yet. Only deception. And deception, as Holmes often reminded me, is not the same as murder. The final suspect was Mrs. Agnes Bell. She had served the Ashcombe family for 20 years and possessed the stern dignity common among women who had spent their lives managing wealthy households. I saw Eleanor enter the library, she repeated. Why did you lie about it earlier? Holmes asked. Mrs. Bell's eyes flashed. I did not lie. You told Inspector Lestrade you saw nothing. I changed my mind. Why? She looked toward Miss Marple. Because some truths are dangerous in a house like this. The room fell silent. Outside, a hansom cab passed along the street, its wheels splashing through rainwater. Gaslight hissed in the hall, and the bitter smell of coal smoke drifted beneath the door. Holmes stood beside the fire. The case is gathering kindling, he said. He turned toward me. Every person here has given us a lie, and therefore nothing. We must discover which lie matters. That afternoon, Holmes returned to the library and examined the revolver again. He scraped its barrel carefully and placed the residue upon a glass slide. Gunpowder? Yes, but not enough. He added a drop of chemical reagent. The residue changed color. Someone cleaned the weapon. I stared. After the shooting? Precisely. Miss Marple stood behind us. Then the murderer handled it. Holmes nodded. The murderer wanted us to believe the weapon had remained untouched. He examined the suicide note once more. Someone staged the entire scene. The fire cracked sharply behind us. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Holmes smiled. Watson, we have gathered enough kindling. I looked toward the dark windows. The fog outside had grown thicker, swallowing Kensington beneath a blanket of gray. The mystery was no longer cold, it was smoldering. You, dear reader, may now ask yourself, which suspect has the strongest motive? Eleanor? Charles? Mercer? Pike? Mrs. Bell? Or perhaps someone we have not yet considered? The evidence was there. 5 suspects, 3 major contradictions, a cleaned revolver, a forged note, and a button that had no business lying beneath Sir Reginald's desk. The embers were gathering. Kindling gathered, smoke rising. The flames approached. Chapter 3. The Smolder. By the following afternoon, the fog had thickened over London until Kensington seemed a city half erased by smoke. I find myself once again setting pen to paper beside the warm fire of 221B Baker Street, for Holmes had insisted upon returning home before proceeding further, claiming that a detective sometimes sees more clearly after stepping away from a crime scene. Mrs. Hudson had brought us hot tea, and the familiar smells of coal smoke, tobacco, and polished wood filled our sitting room, while rain tapped steadily against the windows. Holmes sat with his steepled fingers beneath his chin, staring at the ceiling. Watson, what do we know? Sir Reginald was apparently murdered. The note was forged, the revolver cleaned, and someone planted a button. And there are 5 suspects. 6. I looked up. The mysterious visitor? The person who left the cigarette. I confess that I had forgotten it. Holmes smiled. That is why we must review everything. He spread the evidence across the table. The black button rested beside the tobacco fragment, the handwriting sample, and the tiny card containing the reddish mud from Sir Reginald's boot. The spark, Holmes said, touching the mud. The boot. Yes, observe. He placed the sample beneath his magnifying glass. The red clay is mixed with coal dust and copper filings. The combination is unusual. The kindling? Holmes rose and crossed to the large map of London, pinned beside his desk. Where would copper filings, coal residue, and red clay be found together? I studied the map. Somewhere near the docks? Precisely. His finger moved eastward. Limehouse. The name seemed to darken the room. Limehouse was a world away from fashionable Kensington. Its narrow streets ran toward the Thames, through warehouses, foundries, taverns, and crowded lodging houses, where wealthy gentlemen rarely ventured after sunset. Coal smoke hung heavily there, mixing with Thames mud, horse manure, and the metallic smell of workshops. The flame, Holmes continued, is the tobacco. He held the cigarette fragment between his fingers. Turkish tobacco, smoked by Julian Pike. But Pike admitted coming downstairs at 9. Mrs. Bell says 10, exactly. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The criminal expects us to treat contradiction as proof of guilt, but Pike's lie has a purpose unrelated to murder. What purpose? Debt. I stared at him. Holmes had already sent a telegram to a bookmaker in Whitechapel. The reply arrived within the hour. Pike had indeed visited the man that evening, but he had gone there to discuss Charles Ashcombe's gambling debts. Another ember, another false flame. The blaze was not yet visible. Holmes leaned back. When you have eliminated the impossible, Watson, what remains must be examined without prejudice. I invite you to pause here. Which suspect would you choose? The niece with the missing memory, the nephew with gambling debts, the physician with access to medicine, the secretary with a false alibi, or the housekeeper who knew everyone's movements? Looking back, I should have noticed that the most suspicious person was not necessarily the one with the strongest motive. Holmes had already begun separating lies from murder. Holmes once told me of a case involving a gentleman whose apparent alibi was supported by no fewer than 4 witnesses. The man claimed he had spent an evening at a club in Pall Mall, and the witnesses confirmed that they had seen him there. The police considered the matter settled, but Holmes noticed that none of the witnesses could remember what the man had been wearing. The reason was simple. They had seen him only after he entered the club, while the murder had occurred before his arrival. Holmes discovered that the gentleman had changed clothes in a cabman's shelter near Piccadilly, thereby creating an artificial alibi. His mistake was believing that witnesses remembered events rather than impressions. The ground beneath his feet, the timing of his clothes, and a missing smear of mud betrayed him. Holmes later remarked that the criminal had constructed his alibi from people, while forgetting that the city itself could testify against him. The parallel with Sir Reginald's death was unmistakable. Mercer had a medical motive. Charles had financial trouble. Pike had lied. Eleanor had lied. Mrs. Bell had concealed information. But none of these facts, by themselves, constituted murder. The criminal had created a story. Holmes intended to discover what existed before the story. I have remarked before upon Holmes's singular gifts, but never were they more apparent than during those long hours when he refused to accept the obvious explanation. To my ordinary mind, evidence was something solid, a revolver, a footprint, a letter, a stain. To Holmes, evidence was a language, and every object spoke if one knew how to listen. The tiny patch of mud upon a dead man's boot could tell us where he had walked, just as a peculiar pressure upon a signature could tell us whether the hand had written freely or under imitation. The lesson is more difficult than it appears. We notice things constantly, yet observation and noticing are not the same. A man may see a black button upon a carpet and immediately think it unimportant. Another may see the same button and wonder why it is there. The first person sees an object. The second sees a question. That difference is the beginning of deduction. You, dear listener, may have experienced it yourself. Perhaps you have entered a room and immediately felt that something was wrong without knowing what it was. The mind had noticed an inconsistency before the conscious eye could explain it. Holmes trained himself to pursue that first spark rather than dismiss it. A small ember, then another, then another. The danger lies in choosing the flame too early. Once we decide who is guilty, every later observation begins to support our belief. Holmes did the opposite. He allowed the evidence to contradict him, because a theory that survives contradiction is stronger than one protected from it. That detail smolders. What does it ignite in your mind? The world is full of obvious things which nobody observes. And sometimes the most important clue is not what someone did. It is what they failed to do. That evening we returned to Witchwood House. Holmes requested that Eleanor meet us alone. She entered the library wearing the same dark morning dress, though her hands were bare. Holmes noticed immediately. "Miss Vale, where are your gloves?" "In my room." "Why?" She hesitated. "I had no reason to wear them indoors." Holmes looked toward me. I confess, I could make nothing of it. He asked her to sit. "Did your uncle write anything shortly before his death?" "No." "Are you certain?" "Yes." "Did he use this ink?" Holmes pointed toward the desk. Eleanor looked at it. "Yes." "And did you touch the bottle?" "No." Another hesitation. Holmes reached for her right hand. There, beneath one fingernail, was a faint blue-black stain. I saw it this time. Ink. Eleanor noticed my expression and quickly closed her hand. Holmes said nothing. He merely smiled. The ember had begun to glow. Before we left, Miss Marple approached me in the corridor. "You have seen it now, Doctor." "Seen what?" She smiled. "Exactly." Then she walked away. Holmes joined me moments later. "She enjoys withholding conclusions. Does she know who did it?" "Perhaps." "And you?" Holmes glanced toward the library. "I know who lied." "That is not the same thing. No, Watson." He put on his coat. "But we are getting closer." Outside, gas lamps flickered through the fog, and a hansom cab waited at the curb. Somewhere beyond Kensington, Big Ben chimed the hour, its deep voice rolling through the damp night like a warning from the darkness. Holmes looked toward the east. Limehouse tomorrow. The copper works? The copper works. The embers smoldered. Smoke was rising. Chapter 4. Fanning the Flames. The following morning found London wrapped in a fog, so dense that even the nearest gas lamps appeared as pale moons behind curtains of gray. I find myself once again setting pen to paper to record how Holmes pursued the trail toward Limehouse, for by then the Ashcombe affair had ceased to resemble an ordinary household murder and had become a contest between a criminal's ingenuity and Holmes's relentless observation. We left Baker Street after breakfast, the taste of strong tea still upon my tongue, and descended the 17 steps while the smell of coal smoke and wet wool followed us into the street. A hansom cab carried us eastward. The familiar streets of Marylebone gave way to the Strand, then Fleet Street, and eventually the grimy districts closer to the Thames. Wheels struck the cold cobblestones with a hard rhythm, horses snorted steam into the bitter air, and factory chimneys appeared through the fog like blackened fingers. Holmes sat forward, his eyes fixed upon the streets, occasionally tapping his walking stick against his boot. "You are certain the mud came from Limehouse?" I asked. "Certain enough to investigate. And if it does not, then we discard the theory." You make it sound remarkably simple. Holmes smiled. That is because you know only the conclusion, Watson. The work lies in discovering which embers deserve to burn. You, dear reader, may already suspect that our journey would reveal the murderer. I confess I entertained the same hope. Instead, London gave us another false fire. The copper works stood beside a narrow lane leading toward the river. The air there was thick with coal smoke, Thames mud, hot metal, and the sharp metallic smell of machinery. Men in coarse work clothes moved through the gates, their boots black with soot, while carts loaded with copper sheets groaned along the roadway. Holmes examined the ground. There was red clay. There was coal dust, and there were copper filings. Your ember, I said. Holmes shook his head. No, a location is not a murderer. He questioned the foreman. Had Sir Reginald visited recently? The man remembered him. 2 nights ago, he said. At what hour? Near 7. Holmes's eyes sharpened. Alone? No, a gentleman accompanied him. What gentleman? The foreman hesitated. Dr. Mercer. I stared at Holmes. The doctor had motive. He had access to medicine. He had been one of the last people to see Sir Reginald alive. Now he had been seen with the victim at Limehouse. The flames appeared to leap. We returned to Kensington immediately. Dr. Mercer was waiting in his consulting room when we arrived. Gaslight illuminated rows of medicine bottles, while the room smelled of carbolic soap, spirits, and bitter chemicals. Outside, rain had begun to fall, ticking against the window like impatient fingers. Holmes placed the foreman's statement upon the desk. You visited Limehouse with Sir Reginald. Mercer went pale. I did. Why? He asked me to examine an injured worker. At 7 o'clock. Yes. Why did you conceal this? Mercer lowered his eyes. Because Sir Reginald was investigating my medical accounts. The confession seemed to settle everything. I looked at Holmes, but Holmes looked disappointed. Not murder, he said. Mercer stared. What? You had motive. You had opportunity. You lied about Limehouse, yet you did not kill him. How can you possibly know? Holmes pointed toward the doctor's shoes. Your boots are polished. Mercer looked down. Sir Reginald's murderer walked through wet clay after the rain began. Your boots contain no such residue. I felt a thrill. Another ember. Holmes continued. The rain began in Kensington at approximately 8:30. The murder occurred after 9. Whoever left Witchwood House afterward would have carried wet soil. Mercer had not. His false trail burned away. The doctor sank into his chair. I lied because I feared scandal, he admitted. Holmes nodded. Fear makes liars of innocent men. He turned toward me. Remember that, Watson. We next confronted Charles Ashcombe. His room overlooked the garden, and the cold air leaking through the window made the curtains tremble. Charles stood beside the fireplace, dressed in a velvet smoking jacket, a contrast to the servants' rough tweed and coarse wool uniforms. Holmes produced the bookmaker's telegram. You were not at your club all evening. Charles swallowed. No. You were settling a gambling debt. Yes. Did Sir Reginald know? He threatened to cut me off. Did you threaten him? Charles looked furious. Of course I did. Did you kill him? No. Holmes watched him carefully. Charles finally admitted that he had visited the library shortly before 8 and argued with his uncle, but he insisted Sir Reginald had been alive when he left. What did he say? He said I would never inherit a penny. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Another motive. Yet again, no murder. Then Holmes noticed something beside Charles's fireplace. A pair of boots. He examined them. Red mud. Copper dust. I felt the flames return. Those are the boots, I whispered. Charles stepped backward. Holmes lifted one. Too obvious. What do you mean? The mud is fresh. He scraped it with his knife. It was applied deliberately. Charles stared at him. I have never been to Limehouse. Precisely. The false fire died. Someone had planted the boots. But who? We returned to the library. Miss Marple was there, speaking quietly with Mrs. Bell. Holmes placed the boots upon the table. "Someone wants us to accuse Charles." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. You suspected that?" "I suspected whoever wished to make the evidence convenient." Holmes smiled. "You and I are thinking alike. That can be dangerous." I confess I smiled at the exchange. Then Miss Marple said something that changed the entire investigation. "Mr. Holmes, you have been looking at what people carried into the library." "Yes. You should examine what they carried out." Holmes became motionless. The fire crackled behind us. The room seemed suddenly warmer. "What did Sir Reginald possess?" Holmes asked. "His pocket watch," Mrs. Bell answered. Holmes searched the dead man's clothing. The watch was gone. That was the missing ember. Sir Reginald's gold watch had disappeared. We searched every room. Nothing. Then Holmes examined the suicide note once more. There was a faint impression upon the paper beneath the writing. He held it beneath the gaslight. A watch chain. I stared. The chain pressed against the paper while the note was written. Meaning the murderer placed the watch upon the desk. Holmes turned toward the empty chair, then removed it afterward. Miss Marple's expression changed. "Why?" Holmes looked at her. "Because the watch contained something." Suddenly, footsteps sounded in the corridor. Someone was running. Holmes leapt toward the door, his energy returning in an instant. We rushed after the fleeing figure, down the corridor, past the servants. Through the kitchen, out into the fog. A hansom cab was already disappearing around the corner. Holmes stopped in the street. The figure had escaped, but something lay upon the wet pavement. A small brass key. Holmes picked it up. His face betrayed that peculiar satisfaction I knew so well. "To the watch?" I asked. "No, Watson." He examined the key. "To a strong box." The fog swallowed the distant cab. For several moments we stood in silence, surrounded by the sounds of London's wheels, rain, and distant river traffic. Holmes slipped the key into his pocket. "The murderer is becoming frightened." "How do you know?" "Because a guilty person destroys evidence only after realizing that someone is close to finding it." The fire was no longer merely smoldering, it was beginning to spread. Yet 3 suspects had now been cleared of murder, while another remained hidden behind a wall of respectability. False fires died. The true flame burned brighter. Chapter 5. The Fire Catches. That night, the fog seemed to press against 221B Baker Street with almost human persistence. I had scarcely removed my wet coat before Holmes crossed the sitting room and placed the small brass key upon the polished mahogany table, where the gaslight caught its dull yellow surface. The coal fire burned warmly. The Persian slipper gave off the familiar scent of tobacco, and Mrs. Hudson's hot tea was a welcome comfort after our pursuit through the rain. "You believe the key belongs to Sir Reginald's missing watch?" I asked. "No." Holmes removed his coat and stood before the fire. "I believe it belongs to something the murderer fears more than the police." Miss Marple sat opposite us, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "A strong box," she said. Holmes looked at her. "Quite. I confess that I found the partnership between these two extraordinary." Holmes attacked a mystery through chemistry, geography, handwriting, and physical evidence. Miss Marple approached it through human behavior. Between them, the case seemed to have acquired 2 fires, each feeding the other. Holmes opened the London directory. Sir Reginald maintained several financial offices. His private papers mention a strong box at his solicitor's chambers. Then we should go there. Not yet. He picked up the key. Someone tried to escape with this. He placed it beneath the lamp. There is fresh wax upon the teeth. Wax? Someone made an impression of the key. The implication chilled me. The murderer had copied the key, but why? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Because the original opens something valuable. You, dear listener, may have reached the same conclusion. What would you deduce from the missing watch, the brass key, and the copied impression? We returned to Witchwood House before dawn. The house was silent except for the ticking of the hall clock and the occasional settling of coal in the grate. The servants had retired, but Eleanor was still awake in the drawing-room, staring into a dying fire. Holmes approached her. "Miss Vale, where are your uncle's private papers?" "I do not know." "Think carefully." She looked at him. "My uncle kept everything in a strong-box." "Where?" She hesitated. "The library." Holmes turned toward the shelves. Within minutes, he found a concealed compartment behind a row of legal volumes. It was empty. "Someone has already opened it." Miss Marple examined the shelf. "There is dust on everything except this edge." Holmes smiled. "The spark." He ran his finger along the clean strip. "The compartment was opened recently." I confess that I felt the old excitement rising within me. The mystery was no longer a collection of unrelated clues. The embers were joining. Holmes examined the floor. There was a faint footprint in the dust, small, narrow, a woman's shoe. Eleanor saw it. "I swear I did not open that compartment." Holmes studied her face. "I believe you." She began to cry. "I wanted to protect my uncle's reputation. That is why I forged the note. I found him dead and panicked. I thought if the police believed he had taken his own life, his charities would survive." "Why did you not tell us?" "Because I knew you would suspect me." Holmes's expression softened. "You were right. The confession changed everything." Eleanor had lied, but she was not the murderer. Another false flame collapsed. Then came a knock at the door. Mrs. Bell entered carrying a tray. Her hands trembled. Holmes looked at her. "What is it?" She placed a small object upon the table. "Sir Reginald's gold watch." I stared. "Where did you find that?" "In the kitchen." Holmes picked it up. The watch was cold. Its chain was broken. He opened the case. Inside was a tiny folded piece of paper. Holmes unfolded it. A list of names. Beside each name were amounts of money. At the bottom was one sentence. "Mercer, £4,000, fraudulent certificates." Dr. Mercer. The room seemed to grow colder. Miss Marple looked toward me. "The motive." Holmes nodded. "Now we have it." But he was not satisfied. "Motive is not proof." He examined the watch. There was something else. A faint reddish stain beneath the hinge. He scraped it carefully. Blood. "Human blood. Sir Reginald's?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "No." He smelled the stain. "Medicinal alcohol." He looked toward Miss Marple. "Dr. Mercer." The fire suddenly seemed to leap higher. Holmes stood. "The fire catches." We went directly to Mercer's house. His front door was locked. Holmes forced it open. Inside, the room was in disarray. Papers had been scattered across the floor, bottles smashed upon the carpet, and a bitter chemical smell filled the air. Someone had been searching the place. "Too late," I said. "No." Holmes crossed to the desk. There was an envelope. He opened it. Inside was a receipt from a Limehouse chemist, Digitalis, purchased 2 days before the murder. I felt certain we had reached the end. Then Holmes noticed the date. The receipt had been altered. The original date was visible beneath the ink. The Digitalis had been purchased 3 weeks earlier. "Mercer planned this long ago," I said. "Yes." Miss Marple picked up another paper. "This is Eleanor's handwriting." Holmes examined it. It was a letter addressed to Sir Reginald. The contents were brief. "Uncle, I know what you have discovered. Please, give me until tomorrow. Eleanor." Holmes looked at me. What did she know? Before I could answer, a noise came from upstairs. A floorboard creaked. Holmes raised a finger. We climbed slowly. The upper corridor was dark and cold, with only a thin stripe of gaslight beneath one door. Holmes pushed it open. The room was empty, but the window stood open. On the sill lay a piece of black cloth. Holmes examined it. A torn fragment from a man's coat. Mercer? No. He looked at the stitching. Pike. I stared, but Pike was cleared. Of murder, perhaps. The fragment contained a trace of Turkish tobacco. Pike had been in Mercer's house. Why? We hurried downstairs. Holmes suddenly stopped. Watson. He pointed toward the fireplace. A document was burning there. I seized the poker and pulled it from the flames. Most of the paper had been destroyed, but one line survived. The Ashcombe Foundation, secret account, £18,000. Holmes read it twice. Ah, what? We have been looking for a murderer. He turned toward me. But this case began with a fortune. The implication was enormous. Sir Reginald had been investigating financial corruption. Mercer had a motive. Pike had access. Eleanor knew something. Charles had debts. And someone had copied the key to the missing strongbox. Holmes suddenly smiled. The murderer made one mistake. Which? He believed the missing papers were hidden in the strongbox. But they are not? No. He lifted the burned document. They were hidden in the watch. The missing watch. The copied key. The strongbox. The forged note. The medical receipt. The mud. The tobacco. Everything began to converge. Then Miss Marple spoke quietly. There is still one question. Holmes looked at her. Who knew about the watch? Silence. I thought of Eleanor, then Charles, then Pike, then Mrs. Bell. Holmes's face became intensely thoughtful. Exactly. The murderer had not merely killed Sir Reginald. He had known what the victim carried, and that meant the killer had been close enough to know his private habits, perhaps closer than any of us had imagined. Holmes picked up his coat. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall put the final suspects under pressure. He turned toward the window. The fog was beginning to thin. For the first time, I could see the faint glow of dawn beyond the rooftops. The mystery that had begun as a cold corpse in a Kensington library was now blazing with connections. The fire had caught. Nothing could extinguish it now. Chapter 6. Spreading Blaze. The morning brought little light to London. A grey November fog hung over Baker Street, and the gas lamps remained lit well after breakfast, their yellow flames trembling against the windows of 221B. I find myself once again setting pen to paper beside the coal fire, for by this stage of the Ashcombe affair, every clue seemed connected to another, and Holmes had developed that particular intensity which told me we were approaching the heart of the mystery. Mrs. Hudson served us hot tea and toast. The warmth of the cup was welcome against the chill that had settled into my fingers, while Holmes stood before the fire, examining the burned fragment recovered from Dr. Mercer's house. The account, he said. Yes, the Ashcombe Foundation maintained a secret fund of £18,000. Could Mercer have stolen it? He attempted to. Holmes placed the paper upon the table. But he was not alone. I looked at him. Pike? Perhaps. Miss Marple entered shortly afterward, bringing news from Witchwood House. Mr. Pike has disappeared. Holmes smiled without amusement. The fire spreads. We took a hansom toward Kensington. The fog was lifting slowly, revealing wet streets and rows of blackened chimneys. Along Bayswater Road, horses' hooves struck the cobbles, while newspaper boys shouted the morning editions. London smelled of coal smoke, damp wool, horse manure, and the river, and the gas lamps were finally being extinguished one by one. At Witchwood House, Eleanor waited anxiously. Pike left before dawn, she said. Did he take anything? Only a leather case. What was inside? I don't know. Holmes examined the secretary's desk. There were papers everywhere. He opened a drawer. Empty. Another. Empty. Then he noticed scratches around the lock. The drawer was forced. By Pike? No. Holmes produced his lens. Someone searched this desk. Miss Marple leaned closer. Recently. How do you know? The dust. She pointed to the polished wood. Everything around the lock is dusty, except that small patch. Holmes smiled. The same principle as the hidden compartment. Another ember. I invite you, dear listener, to pause here. What would you look for if someone had searched a desk in haste? Holmes looked beneath it. A scrap of paper was caught against the carpet. It bore only 3 words, "The Old Observatory." "Where is that?" I asked. "Greenwich," Holmes replied. We set off immediately. The journey south took us through increasingly crowded streets until the fog opened upon the broad sweep of the Thames. The river was cold and gray, with barges moving slowly beneath a pale sky. Bells sounded across the water, and the distant cry of dockworkers mingled with the creaking of ropes and the clatter of carts. The old observatory building stood behind a neglected wall. Inside, we found Pike. He was frightened. "I did not kill Sir Reginald," he said before Holmes could speak. "We know." Pike looked relieved. "But you stole the foundation papers." He lowered his head. "Yes." "Why?" "I was being blackmailed." "By whom?" Pike swallowed. "Dr. Mercer." Holmes's expression hardened. Mercer had been using Pike to move money from the foundation. Pike had discovered the fraud and threatened to expose him. Mercer threatened Pike in return. "Did Mercer kill Sir Reginald?" "I believe so." "You believe?" Pike hesitated. "I saw him with Sir Reginald on the night he died." "Where?" "Limehouse." Holmes looked at me. The mud, the copper, the missing watch, everything connected. But then Pike added something unexpected. Sir Reginald was not alone. Who was with him? Eleanor. The room fell silent. I confess that my heart sank. Holmes remained calm. "Describe the meeting." "Eleanor was arguing with her uncle. Mercer arrived afterward." "How long afterward?" 10 minutes. That was crucial. Eleanor had been present. She had motive to protect the family. She had forged the note. She knew about the strongbox. But she still might not have been the murderer. Holmes questioned Pike further. "Did you see Mercer administer anything?" "No." "Did you see Sir Reginald collapse?" "No." "Then you cannot swear Mercer killed him." Pike shook his head. "No." Holmes turned toward me. "The case remains incomplete." Looking back upon that investigation, I have often thought about the difference between motive and opportunity. A man may possess a powerful reason to commit murder and yet remain innocent. Another may have no obvious reason at all, but possess the precise opportunity required. The criminal investigator must resist the temptation to combine motive, opportunity, and suspicion into a convenient conclusion. I remember a former case in which a wealthy merchant was found dead in his office, and suspicion immediately fell upon his son because the young man was heavily in debt. Every fact seemed to support the accusation. He had argued with his father, he would inherit the estate, and witnesses had seen him near the office. Yet Holmes discovered that the father had died hours earlier than believed, and the son had been seen because he had been summoned there by the victim himself. The real murderer was a clerk who possessed no obvious motive but had been stealing from the business for years. His greatest protection was that nobody considered him interesting enough to suspect. That experience taught Holmes, and eventually taught me, that criminals do not always resemble the crimes they commit. Sometimes they hide behind respectability. Sometimes they hide behind another person's scandal. Sometimes they arrange for the innocent to appear guilty. And sometimes, as in the Ashcombe affair, several people lie for entirely different reasons. The result is a fog thicker than London's own. The duty of deduction is to burn through that fog one ember at a time. The careful listener may now see why Holmes refused to arrest Mercer merely because the evidence appeared convincing. The blaze must illuminate every shadow, not merely the convenient ones. We returned to Baker Street by evening. Holmes placed all the evidence upon the table: the tobacco, the mud, the button, the watch, the key, the burned account, the digitalis receipt, Pike's statement, Eleanor's confession. He stared at them for several minutes. Then he reached for his violin. A few low notes filled the room. I waited. Suddenly Holmes stopped. "Watson." "Yes?" "The button." He picked it up. "You said it was black." "It is." "No." He held it beneath the gaslight. "It is not cloth." I leaned closer. The surface was smooth. "Leather?" "Sealed shell." Holmes smiled. "From a morning coat." He turned to Miss Marple. "Who in the household wears a morning coat?" She thought for a moment. "Mrs. Bell." Holmes shook his head. "Not anymore." "Then who?" Miss Marple looked toward the door. "Eleanor." Holmes's eyes gleamed. Eleanor had worn a black morning coat when she arrived at the house. But there was more. Holmes compared the button with the torn fragment recovered from Mercer's house. They did not match. The murderer had deliberately planted the button. But why? To make us suspect Eleanor. Holmes suddenly rose. The killer wanted us to believe Eleanor had entered the library after Sir Reginald died. Why? Because she had. I stared at him. She did enter the library. After the murder. Miss Marple nodded. To forge the note. Holmes pointed toward the evidence. Exactly. Everything fell into place. Eleanor had entered the library after Sir Reginald's death. Mercer had already left. She found the body. She panicked. She forged the note. She touched the revolver. Then she fled. Mercer later returned. He discovered that the scene had been altered. Instead of correcting Eleanor's deception, he exploited it. He planted the button. He planted the boots. He created false trails. He knew Eleanor's guilt would protect him, but there was one thing he could not control: the watch. Holmes opened his eyes wide. The watch contained the proof of his financial fraud, and suddenly I understood. Mercer had killed Sir Reginald not merely to protect his career. He had killed him because Sir Reginald was preparing to expose an entire network of fraudulent accounts. Mercer was at its center. Pike had been an unwilling accomplice. Eleanor had been a frightened liar. Charles had been a gambler. Mrs. Bell had been protecting the family. Each shadow had hidden another shadow. But the murderer stood behind them all. Holmes gathered the evidence. "Tomorrow," he said, "we shall end this." Outside, London was beginning to brighten. The fog had lifted from the rooftops. The gas lamps were going dark. For the first time since the murder, daylight touched Witchwood House. The blaze illuminated what had long been hidden in shadow. Chapter 7. The Conflagration. By 10 o'clock the next morning, we were gathered once more in the library of Witchwood House. London lay beneath a thinning veil of fog, and pale sunlight struggled through the windows, while the last gas lamps hissed in the street outside. The coal fire burned brightly behind us, and Holmes stood before the assembled household with the calm confidence I had come to recognize as the final stage of his investigations. Dr. Mercer stood near the mantel, pale but composed. Eleanor sat beside Miss Marple, while Charles, Pike, and Mrs. Bell waited in uneasy silence. Holmes placed the brass key, the missing watch, the tobacco fragment, and the sample of reddish mud upon the polished table. "You know my methods," he said. "Every clue is an ember, and each ember must be tested before it is allowed to feed the fire." He lifted the mud. The spark. Sir Reginald had recently visited Limehouse, then the tobacco, the kindling. Mr. Pike's Turkish cigarette placed him near the investigation, but not necessarily at the murder. He displayed the forged note, the flame. Eleanor wrote the suicide message after discovering her uncle's body. Finally, he raised the watch. The blaze. This contained the evidence that Sir Reginald intended to expose Dr. Mercer's fraud. I looked at Mercer. He remained silent. Holmes continued. Mercer possessed motive, knowledge, and opportunity. He purchased Digitalis weeks before the murder. He met Sir Reginald at Limehouse. Copper dust remained upon the victim's clothing, and traces of medicinal alcohol were found upon the watch. Mercer's face tightened. "You have no proof I administered the poison." Holmes smiled. "Elementary." The words seemed to strike the room like a match. The fatal dose was prepared by someone familiar with medicine. Sir Reginald's physician was the only person who could administer it without immediate suspicion. You then staged the suicide, cleaned the revolver, and attempted to recover the watch containing your financial records. Mercer suddenly reached into his coat. I stepped forward, but Holmes raised one hand. Mercer produced a folded document. "Then read this." Holmes opened it. It was Sir Reginald's final statement, naming Mercer as the architect of the fraudulent accounts. The doctor sank into a chair. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Everyone trusted you, Doctor." Mercer stared at her. "Yes? And that was your greatest protection?" Holmes nodded. The criminal had hidden in plain sight behind professional respectability. Eleanor's deception, Pike's debts, Charles's gambling, and Mrs. Bell's silence had formed a cloud of confusion around him, but the physical evidence burned through it. I confess that Holmes's powers never ceased to astonish me. The mud had become geography, the tobacco had become movement, the ink had become deception, the watch had become motive, and the smallest traces had become a chain strong enough to bind a murderer. Holmes turned toward me. "The evidence was there from the beginning, Watson. 3 observations. What did they tell you?" I smiled ruefully. "That I should have listened to you sooner." He laughed. Outside, the fog finally broke apart, and sunlight poured across the wet streets of Kensington. The truth blazed forth. No darkness could survive such light. Chapter 8. Ashes and Justice. The arrest of Dr. Lionel Mercer brought a strange stillness to Wychwood House. The fog had begun to lift from Kensington, yet the corridors remained heavy with the smells of coal smoke, damp wool, and the carbolic soap used to cleanse the library after the murder. Outside, hansom cabs rattled along the wet streets, while gas lamps flickered weakly in the pale morning light, as though London itself were reluctant to surrender the darkness. Inspector Lestrade took charge of Mercer and read him his formal statement. The doctor offered no resistance, though his proud bearing had collapsed entirely. His polished boots, once symbols of professional respectability, now seemed to belong to another man. Eleanor watched him being led away. "I thought everyone here was good," she whispered. Miss Marple answered gently, "Good manners are not the same thing as good character." I confess, that sentence stayed with me. Charles Ashcombe approached Holmes next. His face was drawn, and the expensive confidence he had displayed earlier had disappeared. "I shall repay every debt," he said. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Begin by stopping the gambling." Charles gave a bitter laugh. "I believe I have learned my lesson." Pike remained silent near the window. His secret financial dealings had been exposed, but Holmes had established that he had not participated in the murder. He would face consequences for his theft and dishonesty, yet he would not face a murderer's punishment. The distinction mattered. A lie could be kindling without becoming the blaze. You, dear listener, may have noticed how many people deceived us during this case, yet only one deception led directly to death. Mrs. Bell came forward carrying Sir Reginald's coat. I found this after the police had finished searching. Holmes examined the lining. Inside was a small envelope containing several charitable accounts. Sir Reginald had intended to distribute another portion of his fortune among London's poor. The revelation changed Eleanor's expression. He really meant to continue his work. "Yes," Holmes said. She looked toward the window. London stretched beyond it, wealthy houses on one street, crowded workers' dwellings on another, elegant carriages passing children in worn clothing. Victorian London was a city of contrasts, polished mahogany beside rough brick, silk beside coarse wool, warm fires beside freezing pavement. Holmes quietly returned the papers. "Perhaps," he said, "that is the justice he wanted." I watched the police escort Mercer away. The mystery that had begun with a cold body had passed through suspicion, deception, and revelation. Holmes had transformed scattered clues into a single blazing truth, while the innocent had slowly emerged from the shadows. Looking back, I realized that Miss Marple had also changed. At first, she had seemed merely a quiet observer. Now I understood that her calmness concealed extraordinary patience. "Will you return to St. Mary Mead?" I asked her. "Yes, doctor. After all this?" She smiled. "Villages are often more complicated than London." Holmes chuckled. Outside, the final threads of fog dissolved beneath the morning sun. The gas lamps were extinguished. The cobblestones began to dry, and the city resumed its endless movement. Justice had not erased the tragedy, nor could it return Sir Reginald to life. But truth had been uncovered, and the guilty man would answer for what he had done. The fire had consumed the lies. Only the ashes remained. Justice rose from the ashes, as it always must. Chapter 9. Embers Cool. A week had passed before London seemed to breathe normally again. The November fog still drifted along Baker Street, carrying the smells of coal smoke, wet leather, and horse manure, while gas lamps glowed against the evening darkness, and handsome wheels whispered over the cold cobblestones. At 221B, the coal fire burned warmly, and I found myself reflecting upon how completely the Ashcombe mystery had changed the lives of those involved. Holmes sat beside the fire, drawing slowly upon his pipe. "The spark," he said suddenly, "was never the murder weapon." I looked at him. "No? No, Watson. The first spark was the mud." He placed the sample upon the table. "It took us to Limehouse. Then came the second ember. The kindling was the tobacco and the contradictions. They told us where people had lied." He lifted the forged note. The flame was Eleanor's deception. Finally, he opened Sir Reginald's watch, and the blaze was the evidence hidden inside it. I smiled. All from such small things. Exactly. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The observant mind, yours perhaps, dear listener, will understand the lesson. A clue does not need to be dramatic. Sometimes the smallest detail is the most dangerous thing a criminal leaves behind. The Ashcombe family had changed. Eleanor had abandoned her instinct to conceal painful truths. She had begun assisting with her uncle's charitable work and had promised to preserve the foundation he valued so greatly. Charles had sold his expensive racing horse and paid the first installment of his debts, while Pike had accepted a modest position with another firm after admitting his financial misconduct. Even Mrs. Bell seemed lighter. "I have served that family for 20 years, she told me one afternoon. "I never imagined the truth could become such a burden, but it became a relief in the end," I replied. She nodded. Miss Marple had already returned to St. Mary Mead. Before leaving, she had said to Holmes, "The trouble with clever people is that they sometimes look too far away." Holmes had smiled. "And the trouble with observant people is that they sometimes see too much." I confess I still wonder whether either had won their little contest. Perhaps neither cared. The real victory belonged to truth. Looking back, the transformation seems almost extraordinary. Mercer had begun the case, hidden behind respectability and professional authority. Eleanor had stood beneath suspicion because she was frightened, while Pike and Charles were trapped by their own dishonesty. Yet deduction had separated guilt from shame, murder from deception, and truth from the fog surrounding it. London itself seemed transformed. The grey streets were still dirty. The Thames still smelled of mud and coal smoke. The poor still walked beside elegant carriages, and gaslight still flickered through the fog. But I had learned to look differently. A footprint was no longer merely a footprint. A button was a question. A cigarette ash was a map. A hesitation could be a confession waiting for interpretation. I invite you, dear listener, to remember that the next time something apparently insignificant catches your attention, do not dismiss the ember. Ask why it glows. Holmes closed his notebook and reached for his violin. A soft note filled the warm room. Outside, London continued its restless life. Inside, the last traces of the Ashcombe mystery were fading into memory. The embers cooled at last. London breathed easier. Chapter 10. By the Fire at Baker Street. I find myself once again setting pen to paper at 221B Baker Street, where the fire crackles warmly and the November wind rattles the windows. Holmes sits opposite me in his worn chair, the smooth bowl of his pipe glowing faintly in the gaslight, while the familiar scents of tobacco, coal smoke, and old leather fill the room. Outside, London is still wrapped in mist, and the distant sound of hansom wheels upon the cobbles reminds me that the great city never truly sleeps. The Ashcombe affair has ended, yet its embers remain in my thoughts. Holmes has returned to his usual state of languid contemplation. His Stradivarius rests nearby. Scattered papers cover the table, and the Persian slipper sits upon the mantel as Mrs. Hudson moves quietly below. The fire casts warm light across the room, contrasting sharply with the cold darkness beyond the windows. "Watson," Holmes said, "what did we actually discover? A murderer?" "More than that," I considered his question. "We discovered that the smallest details can defeat the most elaborate deception." Holmes smiled. Precisely. The spark had been the reddish mud upon Sir Reginald's boot. It revealed Limehouse. The kindling had been the Turkish tobacco, the contradictions, and the planted button. Each seemed minor, yet each weakened the false story. The flame was Eleanor's forged suicide note. It explained why the case appeared to be suicide, while simultaneously creating suspicion around an innocent woman. And the blaze was the watch, carrying proof of Mercer's fraud. Holmes leaned back. "The criminal mind has one fatal weakness, Watson." "What is that?" "It assumes other people see what it wants them to see." That sentence struck me deeply. Mercer had trusted reputation. Eleanor had trusted silence. Pike had trusted secrecy. But Holmes trusted observation. The criminal may wipe a revolver clean, but he cannot erase every trace of handling. He may forge a signature, but he cannot perfectly imitate another person's habits. He may plant a button, yet the soil beneath his own boots may betray where he has walked. A small ember, Watson, but it glows with meaning. I have often wondered why Holmes insisted upon recording apparently insignificant facts. His answer was always the same, because one cannot know which detail will matter until the whole pattern is visible. That is the science of deduction. Not guessing, not intuition alone. Observation, comparison, testing, elimination, and finally conclusion. I remember another case in which a criminal carefully constructed an alibi around a railway timetable. He knew the train schedule perfectly, but he forgot that fog had delayed the service that evening. Holmes noticed the man's boots were dry, while everyone else had arrived covered in rain. The timetable told one story, the leather told another. The criminal trusted paper. Holmes trusted reality. So it was with Mercer. His story was polished. His evidence was arranged, but the ground remembered, the ink remembered, the tobacco remembered, the watch remembered. Truth does not need to shout. It merely needs to survive every attempt to extinguish it. The fire in the grate suddenly collapsed inward, sending a shower of sparks upward. Holmes watched them. "See that, Watson? The sparks?" "Yes. Each is small. Yet together they sustain the fire." I smiled. "You are becoming poetic." "Do not tell anyone," I laughed. For a moment we sat in silence. Then Holmes lifted his violin. A gentle melody filled the room. I closed my journal slowly. The case had begun with fog, death, and suspicion. It had passed through lies and false trails, then emerged into the clear light of truth. Holmes had remained what he always was, a man who refused to let darkness dictate what could be seen. And perhaps that is the lesson I wish to leave with you, dear reader. Look closely. Question the obvious. Do not confuse respectability with innocence, nor deception with guilt. Most importantly, never ignore the small ember, for from one ember, properly understood, we may light the whole truth. The fire crackled. Holmes played. Outside, London waited beneath the stars. Until the next ember glows, dear listener, the game is always afoot.